What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 14. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS main slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Oh, and good news, guys. Make sure to stay tuned to the very end of this video because we removed the box that was popping up and blocking the lineup. So now you can see a full lineup using these picks that we made in this video if you stay to the very end. Okay, guys, NFL Week 14. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. So the studs that I like on this slate, the top three studs that I like, are Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and Justin Herbert. So out of those three, probably just going to pay up and go with Patrick Mahomes, who has the best matchup out of those three. And my second favorite pick out of those studs would be Josh Allen, coming off of a bad game versus the Patriots. And I like that pick because Vegas thinks there's going to be 53.5 points scored in this game, with the Bills trailing by 3.5. So they have this one as a high-scoring game and a close, competitive game. And you know Josh Allen is going to bounce back after that poor performance versus the Patriots, where he only scored 13 fantasy points. Josh Allen has a good rushing floor. He gets an average of 6.3 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 10% owned, projected at 22.8 fantasy points here in Week 14. He's $7,800 DraftKings salary and $1,000 more on FanDuel. So out of the studs, I like Patrick Mahomes, number one, and then Josh Allen here versus the Tampa Bay Bucks. Now, Justin Herbert, he's been on fire, scoring 29, 25, and 38 fantasy points in the last three games. I'm just a little concerned that he cools off a little bit here. Vegas only thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, so a low-scoring game. And then they have the Chargers favored by 10, so it's possible that the Chargers get ahead by a couple of touchdowns. They end up going to a running game script, takes the ball out of Justin Herbert's hands. So I do like Justin Herbert here, but I think I like Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes quite a bit more. Okay, so moving down off of the studs on the slate, one of my favorite quarterback plays this week is Dak Prescott from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Washington football team, who have the fourth worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Dak Prescott has averaged 21.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 2.7 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 5% owned, projected at 21.7 fantasy points here in Week 14. He's $6,700 DraftKings salary and $1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys favored by 4.5. Now, Dak Prescott scored 12 and 28 fantasy points in his last two games. So I'm looking for a bounce back game from Dak Prescott. He's got a fantastic matchup. So I like Dak Prescott here versus the Washington football team. Okay, now if you want to go out on the risk curve a little bit here and make your lineup different, take a look at Derek Carr from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the third most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Now, Derek Carr has averaged 19.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.4 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 4% owned, projected at 18.2 fantasy points here in week 14. And he's 5,900 DraftKings salary and 1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Raiders trailing by 9.5. So the reason I think that this pick is somewhat interesting is because he's got a great matchup here, and the high-scoring game, 48 points isn't bad, but I like this pick because Vegas thinks the Raiders are going to be trailing by 9.5, and I agree they're probably going to be playing from behind throughout the game, so that's going to put the ball in Derek Carr's hands probably all the way into the fourth quarter, giving him a ton of opportunity to rack up those fantasy points. I think he gets Darren Waller back this week, and he's had some time with his other wide receivers. Hunter Renfrow could be a good stack here with Derek Carr. So I like Derek Carr as a low salary option here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. But my favorite low salary quarterback on the slate this week is Taysom Hill from the New Orleans Saints, playing the New York Jets, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Taysom Hill scored 28 fantasy points in his first game as the starting quarterback last week. He had 11 rush attempts. So those rush attempts are a big part of his fantasy production. So you're getting a quarterback and a running back in one player. He's going to be about 13% owned, projected at 20 fantasy points here in week 14. And he's only 5,600 DraftKings salary. He's 2,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Saints favored by 5.5. So because of his rushing floor, he doesn't need to do too much through the air. He could get 10 rush attempts for 80 yards. He could be the leading rusher on his team this week. So it's a good matchup. His price is just way too low on DraftKings for his upside, especially if he can find the end zone with his legs. So I like Taysom Hill here versus the New York Jets. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So the stud on the slate, I like Austin Eckler from the LA Chargers playing the New York Giants, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Now, I like Austin Eckler, one, because the guy's averaging 22.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.4 rush attempts per game and 5.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 19% owned, projected at 21.2 fantasy points here in week 14. He's 8,300 DraftKings salary and 900 more on FanDuel. But 2, Vegas thinks that the Chargers are going to be ahead in this game by 10, and I do see this game turning into a running game script for the Chargers. I think Austin Eckler gets a ton of work in this game, so I like Austin Eckler here versus the New York Jets. Okay guys, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway. And the winner is Kyle Harler. Kyle Harler, congratulations. You are the winner of this week's $25 PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, now it looks like Alvin Kamara is going to return this week, so I think he's worth considering he has a fantastic matchup. Alvin Kamara from the New Orleans Saints playing the New York Jets, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing running backs. He's averaging 20.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 18.3 rush attempts per game and 5.5 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 17% owned, projected at 19.5 fantasy points here in week 14. He's 7,900 DraftKings salary and 1,100 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Saints favored by 5.5. This matchup is just too juicy to ignore, so I like Alvin Kamara here versus the New York Jets. Okay, now I also like Leonard Fournette. I think Ezekiel Elliott is in a pretty good spot here versus the Washington football team. But if you want to save some salary in your lineup and get a quality running back who's in a decent spot, take a look at Josh Jacobs from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing running backs. Josh Jacobs has averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.4 rush attempts per game and 4.5 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 15% owned, projected at 16.1 fantasy points here in week 14. He's only 6,200 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Raiders trailing by 9.5. Now, there's a risk here that the Raiders fall behind. They have to abandon the run. But the good news is that Josh Jacobs got 9 pass targets last game, scored 24 fantasy points, also had 13 rush attempts. So I'm expecting him to get plenty of volume in this one. So I like Josh Jacobs here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Okay, another couple of running backs that are low salary that are in great spots. I like Antonio Gibson from the Washington football team playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. Now, they have been good versus opposing running backs, but Antonio Gibson is in a good spot here because of the injury to J.D. McKissic. He's going to get a ton more rush attempts. He's going to be the lone back in the backfield for the most part. For example, last game, without J.D. McKissic, he got 23 rush attempts and 6 pass targets. In the game before that, he got 29 rush attempts and 7 pass targets. So just monster volume for Antonio Gibson, who's averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 17.2 rush attempts per game and 3 pass targets per game. So I'm expecting well over 20 touches for Antonio Gibson. He's going to be about 16% owned, projected at 15.9 fantasy points here in week 14. And he's only 6,000 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Washington football team trailing by 4.5. So I like Antonio Gibson here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Now, another low salary running back that I like is Javonte Williams from the Denver Broncos playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Javonte Williams, he scored 33 and 20 fantasy points in his last 2 games, off of 23 and 14 rush attempts, on top of 9 and 4 pass targets. He's going to be about 17% owned, projected at 15.2 fantasy points here in week 14. He's 5,900 DraftKings salary and 800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42.5 points scored in this game, with the Broncos favored by 10.5. So you got a fantastic matchup and what could turn into a running game script. So I like Javonte Williams here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So wide receiver stud on the slate that I like. A couple of studs here that I like. I like CeeDee Lamb from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Washington football team, who have the 4th worst defense overall. They give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. CeeDee Lamb has averaged 17.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.2 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 16.3 fantasy points here in week 14. He's $7,200 DraftKings salary and $600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys favored by 4.5. So fantastic matchup here, and CeeDee Lamb scored 19 fantasy points off of 13 pass targets last game, on top of 1 rush attempt. So I like CeeDee Lamb here versus the Washington football team. Okay, now on the other side of the ball, I like Terry McLaurin from the Washington football team playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Terry McLaurin has averaged 15.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.6 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 93% of the snaps, going to be about 6% owned, projected at 14.7 fantasy points here in week 14. He's $7,000 DraftKings salary, only $100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Washington football team trailing by 4.5. Now, Terry McLaurin has struggled the past couple of games, only scoring 5 and 9 fantasy points, but he scored 24 fantasy points in the game before that. He's got monster upside. He should get a ton of pass targets in this one. Great matchup. So I like Terry McLaurin here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Another wide receiver I like is Tyler Lockett from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Houston Texans, who have the 5th worst defense overall. They give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Tyler Lockett has averaged 15.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 89% of the snaps, going to be about 8% owned, projected at 15.3 fantasy points here in week 14. He's $6,700 DraftKings salary, $600 more on FanDuel. Now Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Seahawks favored by 8, and Tyler Lockett has scored 20, 13, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 5, and 5 pass targets. So DK Metcalf has been hindered with a foot injury. DK Metcalf is still questionable, and if he does play, not sure that he's going to be 100%. So I think that bodes well for the target share for Tyler Lockett. So I like Tyler Lockett here versus the Houston Texans.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Another wide receiver I like is DJ Moore from the Carolina Panthers playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 2nd worst defense overall. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DJ Moore has averaged 15.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.3 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 86% of the snaps, going to be about 16% owned, projected at 14.9 fantasy points here in week 14. He's $6,200 DraftKings salary, $600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42 points scored in this game, with the Panthers favored by 2.5. DJ Moore has scored 17, 16, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 10, 7, and 7 pass targets. And he is one of my favorite wide receivers on the slate. So I like DJ Moore here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, another wide receiver I like is Hunter Renfrow from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They've been pretty good versus opposing wide receivers, but Hunter Renfrow has averaged 15 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 16% owned, projected at 14.5 fantasy points here in Week 14. He's 6,100 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Raiders trailing by 9.5. Now, Hunter Renfrow has scored 22 and 25 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 10 and 9 pass targets. Now, Darren Waller coming back could eat into that target share just a little bit, but he should still get plenty of pass targets, and this could be a passing game script. And I think the Hunter Renfrow, Derek Carr stack, you can save a bunch of salary for the rest of your lineup. So I like Hunter Renfrow here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, another interesting play, it looks like Amari Cooper is going to be back. He's only 5,900 DraftKings salary. He's going to be about 5% owned, projected at 14 fantasy points. He's 5,900 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. He's got a fantastic matchup. The Washington football team have the 4th worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So I think he's got low ownership and he's got big upside if he is truly healthy, which I think he is going to be. He should get plenty of targets. So he's a big-time wide receiver for only 5,900 DraftKings salary, so I like that. So I like Amari Cooper here versus the Washington football team. Okay, now Dallas Cowboys, the 3 wide receivers here, CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, and the other guy that I like is Michael Gallup. And from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Washington football team, so we know he's got a great matchup here. And Michael Gallup is only 5,500 DraftKings salary and 600 more on FanDuel. He got 9, 8, and 10 pass targets the last 3 games, scoring 15, 19, and 9 fantasy points. Now, his ownership has dropped here because Amari Cooper is coming back, so that's going to eat into his target share as well. But I think that makes him an interesting play here this week because he's only going to be about 3% owned. He's projected at 11.2 fantasy points, and he's 5,500 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. So I really like the Dak Prescott stack with 2 of these wide receivers, either Michael Gallup and CeeDee Lamb, or Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb, or you can go Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup for a pretty good salary saving stack there. I like that a lot. I like Dak Prescott, Amari Cooper, and Michael Gallup, saving a ton of salary that you could stack some studs into your lineup. So I like Michael Gallup here versus the Washington football team. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. So the tight end stud on the slate, I'm definitely going to jam this guy into some of my lineups. I like Travis Kelce from the Kansas City Chiefs playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 7th worst defense overall. They give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Travis Kelce has averaged 16.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.8 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 84% of the snaps, going to be about 8% owned, projected at 17.8 fantasy points here in Week 14. He's 7,400 DraftKings salary, 100 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Kansas City Chiefs favored by 9.5. So I like this pick because Travis Kelce, one, he's got a fantastic matchup here, and he's also coming off of a bad game. Only scored 6 fantasy points off of 8 pass targets. So I think Travis Kelce's going to have a monster bounce back game here in this fantastic matchup. So I like Travis Kelce here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Okay, now here's a salary saver tight end for you. I like Jared Everett from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Houston Texans, who have the 5th worst defense overall. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Gerald Everett has averaged 7.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.4 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 72% of the snaps, going to be about 7% owned, projected at 8.7 fantasy points here in week 14. He's $3,500 DraftKings salary, $1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 40.5 points scored in this game, with the Seahawks favored by 8. So with DK Metcalf being hindered, I think some of those pass targets are going to go to Gerald Everett, who scored 3, 15, and 7 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 9, and 4 pass targets. So I like that passing volume for only $3,500 DraftKings salary in a good matchup. So I like Gerald Everett here versus the Houston Texans. And one last guy I want to bring up here, especially if Deebo Samuel is out, take a look at George Kittle from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. George Kittle has averaged 15.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.8 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 100% of the snaps, going to be about 8% owned, projected at 16 fantasy points here in week 14. He's $6,900 DraftKings salary, only $200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 1.5. Now, George Kittle absolutely exploded last week for 43 fantasy points off of 12 pass targets and 1 rush attempt. So if Deebo Samuel is out, you cannot ignore George Kittle here versus the Cincinnati Bengals.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.